Hey everybody, here we go again. Now I know I promised last time that we would get to racing, and I promise that we will. But we've got some other stuff to take care of first. Oh, by the way, just so you know, here is a here is a good picture of my favorite race car. Just so we've got that out of the way, in case I go on too long with the other stuff, I at least did something to have to do with racing. I think you might find it interesting to for me to reply to some of the great comments that have come in. One guy asked about Mike Bloomfield, and yeah, Bloomer was a customer at Prune Music. This was before Mesa Boogie. As a matter of fact, our funky little band, Martha's Laundry, we actually opened for the Electric Flag. And man, I'll tell you what, when I saw Buddy Miles play drums, first of all, the guy he looks like a freaking linebacker in the NFL, and he had just been released from San Quentin prison. And man, the guy pounded the drum. So he had drumsticks that were like 3/4 of an inch thick, and he was wailing so hard, pieces of wood were flying everywhere, and I just went, wow. Okay, I am Poquito man. I need to step up the activity here. Not that I could pound with the strength that he had. Um, yeah. And a cool story about them. I just wrenched on Mike's twin. Like I said, this was years before Mesa Boogie. But my partner at Prune, Larry Craig, did the guitars, and he made a fatal mistake with Mike's Les Paul. He cleaned it. Larry was the setup king, and I'll get into stories about that later on. But Larry could set up a guitar like nobody's business, and man, he ended up setting up all the. I turned Neil Young on to Larry. That's a good story, but I'll go into that later. And Larry ended up, what decades. At any rate, he looks at Bloomer's Les Paul, and it looked like the top of an old car battery. There was just corrosion, just this green, funky shit crystallized all over the pickups and the bridge. So he cleaned that all off. And Bloomfield was pissed. What do you mean? What do you know how many hours and how much sweat it took to get that funky shit on my gut? And you wiped it off? And Larry said, "Yeah, I learned a lesson then. Never do something like that unless you got the explicit permission from the guy." So yeah. By the way, I remember very clearly my friends turning me on to the Paul Butterfield Blues Band, which had, of course, Mike Bloomfield and Elvin Bishop. And I remember hearing this and going, wow, that is some cool ass shit. It was Chicago style blues, South Side blues. And I remember just going, wow, and if somebody had told me then, oh yeah, you'd know these guys, you'd play with these guys, I would have said, "What are you out of your mind? You dream? What? Hey, give me a toke, whatever that is." At any rate, I did get to know Elvin Bishop much better. He lived in Lagunitas and was a pal of one of my pals. That would be Walt Dixon, and he used to jam occasionally at the shack out there in the Dixon Ranch. And I would just play a little shuffle beat on the drums. I was mainly playing flute and sax out there, and it was just a jam for the ages. But Elvin was cool, and I remember him saying, "Hey, who is that guy? He's got a hell of a backbeat. That cat's in the groove." Well, in the groove is something I learned stoned on acid playing, because, again, I didn't know. I'd never taken a lesson. I didn't know what I was doing, but it occurred to me during a band rehearsal. I said, wow, this isn't about me. This is about the group sound. This is about locking down a rhythm and listening to the weakest guy in the band, and we were all pretty weak. At any rate, blah, 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 blah. It's how you learn, right? I also saw recently that the great tabla master, Zakir Hussain, I hope I pronounced his name correctly. Oh, by the way, Elvin Bishop had an SOB. That was a son of Boogie. And Walt Dixon, the guy we jammed with all the time, I'll get into those stories later. He had it, and I said, look at that thing. Man, that thing is so beat up and thrashed. And Walt said, yeah, it caught on fire. And I said, wait a minute. It can't catch on fire. It's got a fuse. And, Elvin put a copper slug in instead of the fuse. But Mike Beninelli fixed it, and it's worked for decades ever since. And I said, man, you got a great super reverb here. How come we're listening to your to your SOB while we're just playing clean jazzy stuff? And he said, well, because it sounds better. And I said, come on, clean sound can't sound better than a super reverb with 410s. Okay, let's try it. And I said, gee, you're right. It does sound pretty good. It does almost sound better. Okay, back to Zakir Hussain, because that reminded me of meeting Robben Ford, who came out to Lagunitas to pick up his Mark I amplifier. And man, a great guy. He came into the house. He played a little piano. In fact, I remember what he played. It was Blue in Green, which is a Miles Davis tune that probably was actually written by Bill Evans. When you listen to the chords, it sounds more like Bill than Miles. Not that it matters. Great cat. And at the end of the hang, he was getting ready to go, and we were outside. It was getting dark, dusk, and he said, oh man, before I leave, can I use the men's room? And I said, yeah, it's straight down there. You see that big fir tree? That's it. It was right next to that. I said, that, what, that? And I said, yeah, just walk down there and water that tree. And by the way, when you're doing it, and this tree had a trunk that was, 4.5 feet in diameter and 120 feet tall. It's a giant tree. I said, while you're doing that, have a look up and contemplate our insignificance in the universe. And he told me later sometime, he said, you know what? I never forgot that. He was playing with George Harrison at that time, went on tour. It was shortly, it was sometime after the Beatles had broken up. And George was playing with the tabla master and a bunch of other Indian cats that had a little bamboo thing about that long, and they played the daylights. I couldn't believe how these guys played. But there's a great George Harrison deal where he's sitting there and there's all these guitars, Gibsons, hanging on the wall behind him. And he says, that's what we needed in the Beatles, you know, Les Paul. Okay, the other part of that Paul Butterfield reminiscence was Nick Gravinitas, the singer, the guy that wrote Born in Chicago. I was born in Chicago in 1942. Shit. He had a Boog Mark I, and he used to come up to the shop and hang out, and he said, man, this is the best blues amp ever made. And I thought, wow, coming from you, that's high praise indeed. Okay, again, I could go on forever about any of these topics. I do want to finish up on the Pioneer Townhouse because it's worth it. And it's also background. I grew up in Orinda, probably the best place at the best time I possibly could have grown up. One of the neighbors, I wasn't even aware of any of this. I became aware of the magnitude of this and my good fortune only after I had some frames of reference. But my neighbor, my first really serious girlfriend, lived in a Frank Lloyd Wright house that was built for her father. And it was right up the creek from where I grew up. Here's a picture of it. And I remember it super well because, man, the house and the people, the Buehlers, Maynard P. Buehler. What a magnificent man. And again, this ties in with architecture and racing and everything because I had that little bug-eye Sprite with a tiny little engine in it, and I wanted to make it as racy as possible. So I got to be actually the surrogate son. Maynard had 2 daughters, no sons. In fact, I got so close to him for so many decades. I was with him the night he passed away. And what a great character. So I would take some of my engine parts over to his machine shop, which, as he told me, well, I told Mr. Wright that for my purposes, the core of the house has to be my machine shop. So if you can picture a Frank Lloyd Wright machine shop, hard to picture, but spectacular is all I can say. And so Oh, can we mill my head? Oh, can we lighten the flywheel? He just did incredible stuff. One time I walked in over there and I stood at the door and he's busy and he's grinding something and he's got his goggles on and his meerschaum pipe hanging out, like the kind that Sherlock Holmes used to smoke. And I waited until I was finished and I said, "Oh, hi, what are you doing?" And he said, "Well, I'm making a cam." I said, "Making a cam? That's a complicated thing. It's egg-shaped. What for? What's the cam for?" "Well, I'm making a vacuum pump." "Oh, your typical DIY, oh, yes, in my garage, I just make the cam for a vacuum pump." "So, yeah, oh, you want to lighten your flywheel? Well, if it'll fit on my lathe, this is something that we can do." At any rate, what an inspiration that cat was. And so the Bug-Eye Sprite was like a shitty go-kart. Frankly, it was my daily driver, and I learned so much from that, driving an underpowered car with terrible brakes. And of course, I learned basic mechanics because I had to rebuild everything constantly. So what'd that car have? High compression pistons, 3/4 cam, milled head, lightened flywheel, headers from Joe Huffaker. Yeah, it was a little bomb. And the only street race that I ever lost was to a Lotus 7. And that guy cleaned my clock. And a Lotus 7 was like the adult version of a Bug-Eye Sprite. It came in many versions, and it, digressing for a bit. Colin Chapman, his theory was the lighter the better. He would design something and then say, now let's add lightness. So the Lotus 7, I wish I had a picture of it because it's a funny looking little thing. Weighs nothing, has no doors. It's halfway between a street car and a race car. It was offered in kit form and with a variety of different engines, and it's still being made and offered today by a company called Caterham. Caterham was the distributor for Lotus 7s. And I've read articles like in Road and Track magazine where the guy said every reviewer should drive a Lotus 7 at least once every year or two, just as a foundational reference point for what the most fun, outrageous, ridiculous sports car is supposed to feel like. Well, and that's what a Lotus 7 feels like. Okay, so let's segue into the racing because I was having a ball. That kind of car, you slide around a lot, just like the Sprite, you slide it. And I worked in tire shops. And so in that era, Ford Falcons and Corvairs both had 13-inch wheels, which was what the Sprite had. But the American car tires were wider and bigger, so I cut out the wheel well. And every weekend, I would put, or as needed, not quite every weekend, I would have these tires. Somebody come in and want a set of 4. There were 2 of them, still had a lot of tread. I would put them on and spend the week, sliding that car everywhere. So I had an invitation from the Electro Voice rep. He said, "Well, you won't take us up on any of the, the offers to go to Hawaii and all that." "Yeah, I don't need to go. But here's something I would like to offer you, and you might be interested." The guy said, "I'm now a partner in a World of Outlaws car. And if you would like, let's go up to this Jimmy Sills School of Racing, and you can drive one of these 700 horsepower methane powered, not a World of Outlaws, 1 degree milder than that." So yeah, we do. We go up there, and it's thrilling. Let me describe the cars. First of all, that the wheel stagger is incredible because you're only turning left, so the outside wheels are like this much bigger than the inside wheels. So I go around a few times. Oh, here's how you start it. He comes up with a pickup truck behind you and he starts pushing you, but the rear wheels aren't turning yet until you get about 25 or 35 miles an hour. Then they start to turn. And as he said, let them turn for a while and then turn on the ignition and watch out because you're going to be unleashing 700 horsepower all of a sudden. So that's kind of exciting. So I go out and do a few laps and he comes over. He's a good Southern boy. So when I imitate accents, which I like to do because it gives character to these cats, I'm honoring them. Please never think that I'm insulting somebody with an accent. I'm doing the opposite. I'm honoring. He said, "Boy, are you a road racer?" And I said, "Yeah, as a matter of fact, how did you know?" Because I hadn't told him anything about I have any experience. He said, "You're a road racer?" And I said, "Yeah." "How did you know?" And he said, "'Cause you're smooth. You're so smooth. In fact, you're too smooth. Let me help you here, boy. And I'm going to set up a cone just past the midpoint on the front straight there. It's an oval. And when you get to that cone, I want you to jab the brakes and let your foot off." And now picture this. The brakes only work on the two inside tires, wheels. There's no brakes on the right side front and rear, only on the left side front and rear. And the brake is not a pedal, it's a bar that runs across the floor of the car. So however sliding around you are, you can hit that. And I said, "Well, that's the brakes?" And he said, "Well, no, yes, no. The point is you hit that to induce rotation, not to slow the car, but to induce rotation." And you've seen these guys. If you watched them, the car is going along and then it starts to change its angle. And so it's pointing the other direction by the time it gets halfway or even less than halfway through the turn at the end. And that's the point. Induce rotation. So it was a freaking ball because, first of all, you can't get the power to the ground. You cannot put 700 horsepower to a bunch of mud. All that happens is the mud and shit is flying, a splat, splat, crash. You know, it's just mud everywhere, all over your face, all over your suit. It's a freaking mess. But man, it is some wild ass fun, I gotta tell you. And so I get back to our home track. That would be Sears Point International, also known, it was called Infineon for years, and then now it's called Sonoma Raceway. We always just call it Sears Point. And I'm still driving the Lotus. I haven't graduated yet to this car. And so I'm just having a ball because I've realized life does not end at a 45-degree slide angle. And I'm throwing this Lotus around like I'm on the dirt. And this guy behind me came up as a guy that we'd had a lot of races with, and he had gotten a really hot shit Porsche. I can't remember the number. I don't know their number. 904, 902, whatever it was. It was a mid-engine, not rear engine. It was a mid-engine, 6-cylinder. It was a very sophisticated race car. In the end, I said, "Larry, what happened, man? I expected with that car, I thought you were going to blow by me several times." And he said, "Well, you know, I started to, and then I thought you were losing it. I thought, you know, this guy's spinning out." And then we got to, and you caught it. And then we got up to turn 7, the same thing. I thought, this cat is losing it because you had that car so sideways. And he said, "Then I realized that's the way you were driving." And he said, "I was laughing so hard, I just followed you around hysterically. That car was at a 45-degree angle at every damn turn." And I said, "Yeah, Larry, I don't even think that's the fastest way, but man," and I told him, Jimmy Sills School of Racing up in Marysville, north of Sacramento. Y'all go up there and you will have a ball, man, because the whole ethic is completely different than these sophisticated little, European race cars that are all finessed out and delicate and all that. They're wonderful, don't get me wrong. That's what I grew up with and admired and ended up spending, 26 years and hundreds of races driving. But it's a whole different approach. Wow. So see, I did get some racing in. And man, I'll tell you what, I could do 10 of these videos just on racing. And I promise you I'll do at least 2 or 3 more. But one thing, I want to make sure people actually have a chance to listen to the end. And if I go on too long, they don't. So maybe I ought to hang it up right here and see if you all like the race stories, because man, we are just, okay, one more, because this is the transition. This is what I wanted to get from the Lotus 7 to the other cars. There's a great guy, Gil Nickel, and you're gonna hear so many Gil Nickel stories, but here's how I transitioned. Gil had a whole fleet of race cars, but one of them he had was a Lotus 26R, which is the race car version of the Lotus Elan. And so we had a great race at Sears Point. He came in first because a Lotus 26R, well, it's a $100,000 car. Mine was a $20,000 car, the most basic. And the 26R is a sophisticated car. So he won. But I more or less kept up reasonably close to him. And so we were talking, and Gil is from Oklahoma. And so he's got a real accent. And we got to talking, and he said, well, how'd you do out there? Man, you were on my exhaust pipe there 3 or 4 times. And I said, yeah. And you know what, Gil? I lost second gear about the 3rd lap, and I realized I didn't need it. If I just kept the hammer down and threw that car really sideways, Jimmy Sills dirt track, I think my lap times were actually faster without second gear. And he said at that time, well, I'm going to call you from now on, you are second gear Smith. And then he said, and you know what? I lost my clutch. And I said, well, from now on, you are no clutch nickel. So you're going to hear a lot of stories about second gear and no clutch if you stay tuned to this channel. So thanks again. I really appreciate reading all your comments. I don't know if I covered them all. That's why I went back to Butterfield and Robben Ford and Mike Bloomfield and Elvin Bishop. And great guys, great time. Unbelievable. Thank you all. See you later.